In this part of the lesson, I want us to look at and think about the Cold War in the 1940s and 1950s, the period in which the Cold War really emerges and develops, and the period in which the Cold War really becomes very, very dangerous very quickly and very global very quickly. This is a period for the world in which this really has a fundamental role in shaping United States from a domestic standpoint, shaping the United States' role in the world, and shaping the geopolitics of Europe, in Asia, and other parts of the world. At the end of the Second World War, the big questions in 1945 there were really two questions, and both are one is sort of to the more responsibility of the United States, and the other to a greater responsibility of the Soviet Union. The questions were, first of all, the atomic weapon, and eventually it will be a nuclear weapon when they start developing thermonuclear weapons in the 1950s. But the United States is the only country that possesses an atomic bomb. It tested the first atomic bomb in the New Mexico desert in July of 1945, the Trinity test. It then, of course, dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 6th and August 9th, 1945, in action associated with the surrender of Japan at the end of World War II. The United States then started testing those weapons. The fourth bomb is tested at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands in the Pacific. And, of course, those tests, Operation Crossroads, those tests were conducted throughout the 40s and early 50s. The United States is the only country with the atomic weapon. And so this is a monopoly for the United States on this super weapon. So the big question was, what does the United States do about that? And the decision the United States makes on that issue is really going to have a lot of impact on the path that the world takes in terms of relations between the communist world and the non-communist world. The other big question, which is really owed most to the responsibility of the Soviet Union, is really Eastern and Central Europe, particularly Germany and Poland, though not only Germany and Poland. There's a number of other countries that fall under the sway of the Soviet Empire. Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, of course, the Baltic states are part of the Soviet Union, along with Belarus and Ukraine, are all under the sway of the Soviet Union, but particularly the eastern half of Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary. These countries are occupied by the Soviet Union. The war for the United States was a war for self-determination. It was a war to allow countries to determine their own government. And in the Soviet Russia's role in defeating Nazi Germany, it was now in a position where it seemed as though it was going to occupy these places. It was going to effectively, forcibly shape their political, economic, and social realities. That's a big question for the world as well. And the decisions that Stalin and the Soviet Union will make on Poland, on East Germany particularly, will very much shape the path and the development of the Cold War. And you see down here, up here, this map is Germany. Okay, so this is what Germany looks like at the end of the Second World War. Here you see more or less the borders of Germany today. This is East Germany, controlled by the Soviets, the British controlling this part of West, the United States, and of course the French. Now over here, the Poland are controlling these areas, and these of course will become part of Poland. Now, interestingly, right here, you have the city of Berlin. Berlin became this island, a kind of microcosm of the divisions of the Cold War, located deep in the heart of Soviet East German territory. Now, East Germany is technically an independent state, but it's really a Soviet satellite state, more or less. The Soviet Union is influencing their politics, economics, and so forth. At the end of the Second World War, Berlin, the capital of Nazi Germany, Berlin was occupied by all of the Allied powers. And in fact, you can look at this, And as you can see by the colorations here, you can tell that occupation is very similar. It's like a microcosm in the city of Berlin, the old Prussian city, home of famous landmarks like the Brandenburg Gate. Berlin itself became a divided city. And in the late 40s, the United States and its allies, the British and the French, they maintained the right of West Berlin to remain free and independent, to remain Western. The Soviet Union under Stalin tried to force the Allies out of Berlin. They blockaded the city, and famously in the Berlin airlift. In the late 40s, the United States and the British flew supplies into West Berlin, ultimately securing the permanent sort of Western independence of the city of West Berlin. But it became like a microcosm of the Cold War, located deep in Soviet-influenced East Germany. Down here, of course, you see what the Cold War division of Europe looks like, with Western Germany, East Germany, and of course Poland and these other Soviet states, or Warsaw Pact states, other states under the influence of the Soviet Union. What happens, as you're probably not surprised, and as this map depicts, the U.S. refuses to give up the nuclear monopoly, and the atomic monopoly. And in truth, it's a very difficult decision to expect the then President Harry Truman to give away the atomic bomb. And there were proposals on the table that might actually do that. So, for example, the options that the United States really had were to hold on to the weapon, to develop it, and test it more. Or the United States could turn the weapon over to the newly formed United Nations, the Atomic Energy Agency of the United Nations, and allow them to independently control this technology so that no country would possess it. And of course, Stalin eagerly supported that. But there's a long history of distrust between Stalin, the Soviet Union, communism, and the United States. And Truman was very fearful that if the United States were to give up this technological advantage, that it might find itself in a situation where the Soviet Union would go ahead and create their own anyway, and it would possess that advantage. And so Truman decides that, as does the majority in his cabinet, that the United States cannot give up the atomic monopoly. It chooses to hold on to the atomic monopoly. It's working together and sharing it with some of its allies, like the British, but it chooses to hold on to this rather than to get rid of it. In response, of course, the Soviet Union will increasingly work towards developing their own weapon. Likewise, Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, right here, this is Russia, and in the lighter colors are the greater Soviet Union. Stalin, the dictator of the communist Soviet Union, refuses to back out of Eastern Europe. The Soviet troops will stay there. Their allied troops will stay there. And as a result of that, the United States and its allies will stay in Western Europe as well. The numbers that you see here are troop strength numbers. And this is depicting really the height of the sort of standoff, military standoff between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Now, what's NATO? NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's an alliance. It's a system of alliances. All the countries that you see in a blue shade here are members of NATO. And what it means is, as members of NATO, the United States will station troops. It will provide military supplies. NATO is also a military organization, so NATO will control certain types of weapons. It will have its own troops, and there will be bases, NATO bases, formed all around these areas, as well as American bases. And if the Soviet Union is to attack any place in the NATO alliance, it's an attack on all of them and could result in a coordinated war against the Soviet Union. The idea with the NATO alliance was to be a deterrent to the potentiality of Soviet Russia seeking to seize the rest of Western Europe effectively. In 1955, the Soviet Union created, as a response to NATO, it created its Warsaw Pact. And the Warsaw Pact worked the same way. And these are your Warsaw Pact states down here. Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Poland. These are your Warsaw Pact, the heart of your Warsaw Pact states. Albania was a Warsaw Pact state for a period as well. And these states, again, formed into an alliance with the Soviet Union. So the two sides form alliances. They are divided ideologically in terms of their ideology of the state, their ideologies of economics, and they are intensely militarized and standing off. And it seems that in the 1940s that the next war will happen in Europe, that it will be a major war between the United States and its allies and the Soviet Union and its allies. And so this is really at the core of the beginning of the Cold War. When we think about the United States, the policy of the United States during the Cold War, during much of it at least, is known as the Containment Policy. And the idea with the Containment Policy was to contain the expansion of the Soviet Union and communism in general, really. I should say it's to contain the expansion of communism. Initially, in the 40s, it's seen most as associated with the Soviet Union, but things change in 1949, and we're going to see that in just a moment. In 1946, the situation in Europe is incredibly bleak. I mean, cities are destroyed. World War II was a war of annihilation. You're talking about 50 million not only killed, but at the end of the war, between Germany and the Soviet Union, there were 50 million homeless people. The economies of countries like Germany were completely destroyed. And so cities and nations are in ruins. And it is a very bleak situation. What the United States is worried about here is that when you have very, very desperate situations, these types of situations can appeal to communist movements, because communist movements will typically appeal most, like did fascism in the 30s. Communism is a kind of a radical position, like fascism, and they will appeal most to people when they are in desperate times. And the communist propaganda would suggest that they would be creating a world in which everyone was effectively equal, and that everybody would have their needs met and then some. Everyone would have a job, and they would contribute to the state. And when you're in a situation where your countries are utterly destroyed, those types of ideas can gain momentum with people. There were communist movements, legitimate political communist party movements in France and Italy during this time period. The United States is worried that if they don't do anything, because before in American history, what the United States would do is it would fight a war, and then it would effectively scale down its military, it would go back home, and it would not be militarily engaged, and it wouldn't be engaged in foreign aid in a meaningful sense. That's how the United States sort of operated for the century and a half before the beginning of the Cold War. But the Cold War, the end of World War II and the emergence of the Cold War changed everything. Because the United States understood, as a global power now, the United States is emerging as a global power. As a global power, it cannot just turn its back on Western Europe or other parts of the world and allow them to be taken over by the forces of communism. That would mean that the United States would effectively be isolated in the world. It would have no allies. It would have no one to trade with and work with. So the idea of losing France and Italy to communist movements was really, particularly ones where it might result in an election, because these were legitimate political parties in places like France and Italy. This was not acceptable. The United States needs economic markets in places like Europe, in places like Asia, to trade, to sell, to work with. And so the United States really has to deal with this problem. Because if they don't do anything about Europe, if they turn and go back home and kind of assume no active role in Europe in the post-war period, the result could be a communist Western Europe, and that was hugely feared by the United States. I mean, effectively, the United States was fighting in World War II to prevent a radical regime from controlling all of Europe, and particularly Western Europe. And now it seemed that it was faced with that potential scenario again with the Soviet Union in the aftermath of World War II. There were also anti-government, communist-leaning, not necessarily directly supported by the Soviet Union. There were anti-government resistance movements in both Greece. Greece had a monarchy, and also Turkey right here. So here in Greece and Turkey, you already had two cases where it looked like you could have two countries fall rather quickly to leftist revolutionary movements that might sweep them into the sway of the Soviet Union. And it was believed that if that were to happen, it could spread across Western Europe. So the United States' response to this reality is to create what is known as the Containment Policy. And the way it does this is with two very important developments in 1947 and 48. One is the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine was the beginning of the Containment Policy. Truman gave a speech before Congress, asking Congress to provide funds, provide aid to the Greek and Turkish leadership. And in so doing, to allow them to prevent a communist uprising, an overthrow of their governments, and their falling into the sway of the Soviet Empire. So, Truman scares Congress really by saying, we cannot go back to the way this was. We cannot go back to the reality of 1930. We can't be isolationists. We have to be engaged in the foreign world. We have to provide foreign aid, military and domestic. We have to do this, or you're going to have a communist Western Europe. And it worked. Americans who were in Congress, who were historically fiscally conservative, for example, those individuals voted for these aid packages. And the United States began making a foreign commitment that was really unlike anything else it had ever done before, this level of foreign involvement in terms of aid, economic aid, military aid, and so forth. So the Truman Doctrine begins the containment policy, containing communism, by providing funds to support the Greeks and the Turks, and to keep them in the American sphere of orbit. Later, in 1948, the United States creates the Marshall Plan, named after George C. Marshall, who was former Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State. George C. Marshall received sort of the name of this massive aid plan. It was a $15 billion aid plan. And all of these bars here on the map show you, to give you an idea of where most of the aid went to. And the idea was the United States was going to use its money, its power, economically, militarily, to rebuild these countries, to give them aid to help rebuild their economies, to help provide them with the necessities of not only economic recovery, but also national defense. And so the Marshall Plan began a program of the U.S. foreign aid supporting allies and emboldening its efforts to contain communism. Interestingly, the United States offered the aid to the Soviet Union as well. But of course, the Soviet Union couldn't accept that aid. It was a kind of almost like a ploy to the Soviet Union, because if the Soviet Union accepted a huge amount of aid from the Western capitalist United States, that aid could come with strings attached. That aid could be open the door to the United States, basically inserting its goals and its economic power into the Soviet empire, and it could pose a potential threat to the stability of the Soviet Empire. And so the Soviet Union cannot accept that Marshall Plan aid. But it's the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan that really, more than anything, create the basis for the American containment policy. And at this time, it's in Europe is where it's focused on. But that's going to change.